I don't know how long I sat there going through her phone, but I screenshotted everything. I couldn't just let it slide. I saved all the proof to my own phone because I knew at that moment I was going to need it. The next day, I barely slept. I felt sick thinking about what I was going to do. I didn't want to just blow up right then and there, so I decided to wait. But I also knew that this wasn't just about me. Maggie, Dan's wife, she had to know too. I mean, how could I not tell her? She was going through her own struggles, having just had a baby herself, and I didn't know how she was going to take it. But it felt like the right thing to do. I reached out to Maggie later that day. I went over to her house while Sarah was still at home with Jason. It was hard, man. I sat there, trying to find the right words, but no matter how I put it, it was going to shatter her world too. Eventually, I just told her everything. She didn't cry at first, she just stared at me like her brain couldn't process it all. I gave her the screenshots I'd taken, and that's when she started crying. I don't think I've ever felt so bad for someone in my life. I felt like the bearer of bad news wrecking someone else's world. But I knew I couldn't stop there. I had to confront Sarah. That evening, I sat her down and I just let it all out. I told her what I'd found, how I knew everything, and that I wasn't going to let it slide. She started crying, of course, begging me to forgive her, saying it was a mistake and that she still loved me. But it didn't matter. I couldn't trust her anymore, and there was no way I was going to keep living a lie. I told her I wanted a divorce, and that was it. I wasn't playing around. I even went and got a paternity test for Jason because the affair lined up with when he was conceived. I hated that I even had to do that, but I couldn't shake the doubt. Waiting for those results was brutal, but I needed to know for sure. 2 days later, I came home from work, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. Jason was in his crib, crying his eyes out. But Sarah? She was gone. No note, no explanation, just gone. My heart sank. I went through the house looking for her, thinking maybe she'd gone to the store or something. But no, she'd left. The only thing I found was a note she'd left on the table. In it, she said she didn't love me anymore, and that she had left with Dan. She told me not to contact her, and that was it. She'd taken off, leaving me alone with our baby. I knew she was leaving, but I never thought she'd actually abandon Jason. That's what broke me the most. How could someone leave their 6-month-old son? How could a mother do that? It didn't make sense. I couldn't wrap my head around it. But there it was, right in front of me. She was gone. I picked Jason up and just held him, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I felt lost, like my whole life had just collapsed. Everything I thought I knew about Sarah, everything I thought we had, was gone in an instant. Wife abandoned me and our son 10 years ago. Now she demands to have her family back. All right, here it goes. I'm going to start from the beginning. And honestly, writing this down is making me remember all the crap I went through. So here's my story, and I hope it'll help someone out there who's been in a similar situation. So, I'm 34 years old now, but let's rewind to 2012. Back then, I was in my mid-20s, and I had just married Sarah. She was a year older than me, 35 now. We got married after dating for a few years, and everything felt like it was falling into place. You know that feeling where you think, yeah, I made it? That's where I was. I had a decent job, we had just moved into a nice little house in a quiet neighborhood, and we were expecting our first baby. Jason, my son, was born in 2013. And man, becoming a dad felt like the most incredible thing. I can't even describe it. I'd wake up in the middle of the night just to check on him, even if he was asleep. It's one of those feelings you can't fully understand unless you've been there. My world revolved around him. But here's the thing. Life doesn't give you a heads up when it's about to slap you across the face. I thought everything was perfect. Sarah and I were busy with the baby, adjusting to being new parents, and figuring out the whole work-life balance. But just when I thought things were going well, the first crack appeared. It was November 2013. Jason was about 6 months old. Sarah had gone to bed early because she was tired from dealing with the baby all day. I stayed up late watching TV, nothing special, and then her phone, which was charging on the coffee table next to me, buzzed. I didn't think much of it at first. People get texts late sometimes, no big deal, right? But for some reason, this time, I looked. And what I saw next changed everything. The message was from our neighbor. Let's call him Dan. It was one of those flirty, suggestive texts, and my gut just dropped. I'm talking about that pit-in-your-stomach feeling when you know something's really wrong. I didn't touch the phone at first, just stared at it, my mind racing. My brain was trying to convince me I'd read it wrong, like maybe it was a joke or something. But I knew better. I picked up her phone and yeah, I went through her messages. I wish I hadn't. What I found wasn't just a flirty text. It was months of sexting, sending nude photos, and talking about meeting up at hotels. It wasn't just some casual thing. They'd been at it since, well, apparently from the very first week we got married. I was freaking furious. I felt like an idiot, like I'd been completely blind to what was going on right under my nose. Everything we had, or I thought we had, felt like a damn lie. The days after Sarah left were a blur. I don't even remember what I did right after I found her note. I just kind of went into autopilot trying to keep things together for Jason. There were moments when I'd just stare at him and wonder, how the hell am I supposed to do this alone? I mean, I was a good dad, but I never imagined raising a kid by myself. The first thing I had to do was let people know. I didn't want to, but I couldn't keep it all in. I called my parents first. My mom was shocked, obviously, and my dad? Well, let's just say he wasn't exactly surprised. He never really liked Sarah. He thought she was too self-centered and always put herself first. Maybe he saw something I didn't, but I didn't care back then. I was in love, and I ignored all the red flags. Anyway, I also had to call Maggie. She was going through her own version of hell, having just found out her husband was with Sarah, but I figured she needed to know that Sarah was gone. When I got to her house, I barely had to say a word. I think she already knew. It was like she was just waiting for the shoe to drop. Maggie was standing there, holding her baby, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was going through postpartum, and now her husband had run off with my wife. It was like both of our lives had just blown up at the same time. Dan left too, she said when I walked in. I just nodded. We didn't need to talk much. We both knew what was happening. We were in the same sinking boat. We sat down, and I told her everything that had happened. How Sarah had left Jason, the letter she wrote, all of it. Maggie listened, nodding, trying to hold it together. But at some point, she just broke down crying. And honestly, I did too. It was like all the pain and confusion and anger just came out at once. After that, we just started helping each other out. We didn't really talk about it much at first, but it was kind of an unspoken thing. Maggie would come over to my place, or I'd go to hers, and we'd take care of the kids together. Jason and her baby were close in age, so it just made sense. I wasn't prepared to handle everything on my own, and neither was she. One day when Maggie was over, she just started breastfeeding Jason like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't even ask her to, she just did it. I think she saw how overwhelmed I was. Jason was crying a lot, probably confused and missing his mom, and Maggie just stepped in and started taking care of him like he was her own. It sounds weird, but in those moments, it felt like we were becoming a family. Not in the romantic sense, not yet anyway, but more like we were just two people trying to survive, trying to give our kids the stability they needed. We didn't talk about Dan or Sarah much. I think we both just wanted to forget they existed, at least for a little while. But of course, they were always in the back of our minds. There was no way to completely escape what had happened. I tried reaching out to Sarah's family a few times. I wasn't expecting much, but I thought maybe they'd know where she went or what she was planning. Her dad answered the phone the first time I called. He was as confused as I was. He didn't have a clue where she was and sounded genuinely shocked when I told him what had happened. Apparently, Sarah hadn't mentioned anything to them, not even a hint. Her dad was furious. He said if she ever tried to come back, she wouldn't be welcome in their house. They pretty much disowned her right then and there. I didn't feel bad for her. She made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Things were hard though, real hard. There were days when I just felt like giving up. I was working full-time, trying to raise Jason, and dealing with the emotional mess Sarah left behind. But I kept going, mostly because I didn't have a choice. Jason needed me, and that's what kept me grounded. Maggie and I kept getting closer over the next few months. Not in a romantic way at first, but we just leaned on each other. She was helping me out, and I was doing my best to support her too. It was like we were just trying to survive, and it felt good knowing I wasn't totally alone in all of this. One day, Maggie came over with her son like usual, and we were sitting in the living room, watching the kids play. She turned to me and said, "You ever think about what we're going to tell them, when they're older?" I hadn't thought about it too much. I was so wrapped up in the day-to-day, just trying to keep everything together, that I didn't have the mental space to think about the future. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess we'll just figure it out when the time comes." But that wasn't a good answer, and I knew it. At some point, Jason was going to start asking questions. About Sarah, about why she left, and I didn't know how I was going to explain that to him. How do you tell your kid that their mother abandoned them? Maggie nodded, but she didn't push it. I think she was just as lost as I was when it came to that. Over time, we started doing more together. We'd take the kids to the park, go out to lunch, stuff like that. It felt like we were becoming a family, and Jason started calling Maggie Mom. I didn't even tell him to. He just started doing it one day and Maggie didn't stop him. I was grateful for her, but at the same time I was terrified. What if Sarah came back one day? What if Jason found out the truth and hated me for it? These thoughts kept me up at night, but I didn't talk to anyone about them. I just kept it all inside, trying to push through each day. We still didn't talk much about Dan or Sarah. It was like an unspoken rule between us. We just focused on the kids and getting through the day. But I knew deep down that the past wasn't done with us yet. As time went on, things between me and Maggie started to shift. We were still just friends, but there was this unspoken connection building between us. I don't know if it was because we had been through similar hell or because we spent so much time together, but it was there. And honestly, it scared me. I wasn't ready to move on from Sarah, even if she had abandoned me and Jason. Part of me was still angry, but another part of me felt like I hadn't really let go of what our marriage was supposed to be. It's like I was stuck between wanting to move on and not being ready to let go of the idea of my family, even though Sarah had destroyed that. But Maggie was different. She was strong. She had been hurt just like me, and yet, there she was, taking care of her son and helping me with Jason. Every day she showed up. Every day she was there when I needed someone, whether she knew it or not. One day we were sitting at the kitchen table, the kids were napping, and we just started talking about everything. Our exes, the betrayal, the hurt, all of it. It was the first real conversation we had about what had happened. Until then, we'd kind of avoided it, I guess because neither of us wanted to open those wounds. I still can't believe he just left, Maggie said, staring at her coffee cup. I mean, I know we weren't perfect, but how do you just leave your kid like that? Her voice cracked a little, and I could see how much it was eating her up inside. I don't get it either, I replied, shaking my head. It's like Sarah just woke up one day and decided she didn't care anymore. I don't think I'll ever understand it. We sat there in silence for a while after that. It wasn't awkward or anything, just heavy. The kind of silence where you both know what the other is thinking, but there's nothing else to say. We had both been left in the dust by people who were supposed to love us, and there was no fixing that. As the weeks passed, it started to feel like we were in this strange in-between place. Maggie was over almost every day, and our lives were so intertwined that it was hard to imagine what things were like before everything blew up. We had our routines, our inside jokes, and of course, our kids. It felt like we were a family. One afternoon, we took the kids to the park. It was a warm day, and Jason and Maggie's son were running around chasing each other, laughing like nothing in the world could hurt them. I watched them and felt this weird mix of sadness and happiness. Sad because their actual parents weren't there for them, but happy because, at least for now, they had each other. And they had us. At one point, Jason ran over and grabbed Maggie's hand, calling her mommy without even thinking about it. It stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't told him to call her that, and neither had Maggie. It just sort of happened. And the craziest part, Maggie didn't correct him. She just smiled down at him like it was the most natural thing in the world. After the park, we went back to my place for dinner. We were both exhausted from chasing after the kids all day, and we plopped down on the couch while they played with their toys in the living room. Maggie looked over at me and said, "You ever think about what's next for us?" I wasn't sure what she meant at first, so I asked, "What do you mean?" She sighed, then leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. "I mean, is this it? Are we just going to keep doing this? Helping each other out? Raising our kids like this? I don't know what I'm asking, really. I guess, do you think we're more than just friends now?" Her question hit me like a brick, but in a good way, if that makes sense. I hadn't allowed myself to think about it, but I knew exactly what she was talking about. There was something between us. I wasn't sure if it was love, or if we were just clinging to each other because we didn't have anyone else. But whatever it was there. "I don't know," I said, being as honest as I could. "I guess I've been afraid to think about it. Everything with Sarah still feels so raw, you know? But you're right. There is something here." Maggie nodded, and for a minute, neither of us said anything. I think we were both scared of what would happen if we crossed that line. "I'm not saying we have to figure it all out right now," she added quickly. I needed to know if you felt it too." "I do," I said, finally looking her in the eyes. "I really do." And that was that. We didn't kiss or anything. We didn't rush into some big romantic moment. But we both knew something had changed. It was like we'd acknowledged this connection we'd been dancing around for months, and now that it was out in the open, it wasn't going away. Over the next few weeks, things stayed pretty much the same, but there was this undercurrent between us. It was like we both knew where things were headed, but we weren't in a rush to get there. We kept taking care of the kids, helping each other out, and spending time together. But now, it felt different, like we were building something new, something real. Then, one evening after we had put the kids to bed, Maggie leaned over and kissed me. It wasn't planned. It wasn't some big romantic gesture. It was just right. And in that moment, everything shifted. We didn't talk about it much after that, but the line had been crossed. We were together now, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Looking back, I can't say when it happened exactly, but somewhere along the way, we had gone from two people helping each other survive to something more. We had become a family. And honestly, it felt damn good. It's weird how life can shift on you without you even realizing it. One minute, you're barely hanging on, and the next, you've got a whole new life in front of you. That's kind of what happened with me and Maggie. We didn't plan on becoming a couple, it just sort of happened. We had been through so much together that when it turned into something more, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. After that kiss, things changed between us. But it wasn't this huge dramatic shift. It wasn't like we suddenly moved in together or started calling each other babe or whatever. It was more subtle, but it was there. The way we'd sit a little closer when we watched TV after the kids went to bed. How she'd rest her head on my shoulder when she was tired. It was like the closeness had always been there, and we were just letting it be what it was. But of course, life doesn't give you any time to get comfortable. Just when things started feeling like they were finally falling into place, Jason stumbled onto something I wasn't ready for. One afternoon, we were going through some old boxes. I'd been cleaning out the attic, trying to make more space for storage. Jason was playing around with some of his old toys, asking questions about random stuff as kids do. That's when he found it, a photo album I hadn't touched in years. It was one of those big, old-school ones where you had to peel back the plastic to stick the pictures in. He pulled it open, and the first picture he saw was of me, him, and Sarah at the hospital the day he was born. I hadn't thought about that photo in a long time, and seeing it now, it felt like a punch to the gut. "Who's that?" Jason asked, pointing at Sarah. I froze. I didn't know what to say. Up until that point, Maggie and I had told him that his birth mom had passed away. It seemed like the easiest explanation at the time. But now, staring at that picture, I realized how big of a mistake that lie had been. Jason deserved the truth, but I didn't have a clue how to explain it to him. How do you tell a 7-year-old that his mom didn't die? That she left? I started, but my words got stuck in my throat. I looked over at Maggie, who was sitting across the room. She gave me a soft nod, encouraging me to say what needed to be said. I took a deep breath. "That's your birth mom." Jason furrowed his brow, not fully understanding. "But I thought my mom was Maggie." "She is, buddy," I said quickly. "Maggie is your mom. She's been taking care of you since you were a baby. But that woman in the picture, she's the one who gave birth to you." He looked confused, which made sense. It was a lot to dump on a kid all at once. I could see the gears turning in his little head, trying to make sense of what I was saying. "Where is she?" he finally asked. I wasn't ready for that question. I didn't have a good answer. I had no idea where Sarah was. The last I'd heard, she was off with Dan, living God knows where. But I couldn't tell him that. He was too young to understand the whole mess of it. "She's not here anymore," I said carefully. "She left when you were a baby." "Why?" That one hit me hard. It's the kind of question that doesn't have an easy answer, and it hurt knowing I had to try and explain it to him. I looked at Maggie again, hoping she'd jump in, but this was my mess to clean up. She knew that, and I did too. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Sometimes people make bad choices, and they don't always think about how it's going to hurt the people they love." Jason didn't say anything after that. He just sat there, staring at the picture for a long time. I wanted to tell him more, but I didn't know where to start. How do you explain to a kid that his mom walked out on him and never looked back? I hated that I couldn't give him a better answer. Eventually, he closed the album and handed it back to me. "Can I go play now?" "Yeah, buddy, go ahead." He ran off to play with Maggie's son, leaving me and Maggie sitting there in silence. I felt like a failure. I had tried so hard to protect him from the truth, but now it was out there and I couldn't take it back. Maggie came over and sat next to me on the couch. She didn't say anything at first, just put her hand on mine. After a few minutes, she finally spoke. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "He needed to know." "I feel like I just made everything worse," I admitted. He's going to grow up wondering why she left, and I don't have an answer for him. We'll figure it out, she said, squeezing my hand. He's got us. He's not alone in this. She was right. Jason wasn't alone. He had me, and he had Maggie, and together, we'd get through it. But it didn't stop me from feeling like I had let him down. I should have told him the truth from the start, but instead, I had fed him a lie because it was easier. Now I had to deal with the consequences. Over the next few days, Jason didn't bring up the picture again. He went about his normal routine, playing with his toys, going to school, and hanging out with his friends. But I could tell something had shifted in him. He was quieter, more thoughtful. I could see the wheels turning in his head, and it killed me knowing that he was probably still trying to make sense of everything. I kept expecting him to ask more questions, but he never did. Maybe he wasn't ready, or maybe he was just trying to process it on his own. Either way, I knew this wasn't the end of it. The questions would come eventually. And when they did, I'd have to be ready to give him the answers he deserved. But for now, I just had to be there for him. Be the dad he needed, even if I didn't have all the right words. And no matter what happened next, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going anywhere. I'd be there for him, every step of the way. Life with Maggie was good. After divorcing Sarah, Maggie and I got engaged about a year later. We were already like a family, so it felt like the natural next step. We got married and had our first child not long after. Together, we built a life where we were happy, and for the most part, the mess with our exes seemed like a distant memory. We'd talk about them from time to time, but mostly it was just to remind ourselves how far we had come, how much better things were now. But then, fast forward 10 years, and out of nowhere, an anonymous email showed up in my inbox. I didn't recognize the sender, but when I opened it, the message made it crystal clear who it was from. It read, "I want to see my son and get my family back. We're not divorced yet." I felt this weird mixture of shock and anger reading that. It was Sarah. After all these years, she decides to pop back into our lives, acting like nothing had changed. I hadn't heard from her since she left, and now she's claiming we're not divorced? The nerve of her. I showed the email to Maggie, and she instantly freaked out, understandably. She asked me, "Are you going to take her back?" I could see the worry in her eyes. She was scared that Sarah could somehow come back and ruin everything we'd built. I hugged Maggie and told her exactly how I felt. She's an ugly part of my past, and I would never leave you for her. I'd never take her back, ever. That calmed Maggie down, but the situation wasn't simple. Even though there was no way I was taking Sarah back, now I had to figure out what to do about her request to see Jason. The thing is, I have full custody of Jason, because Sarah was nowhere in the picture for all these years. She left, and I was the one who raised him. But now that she's back, does she still have any rights? Could she mess up our lives again by trying to claim custody or visitation? I had so many questions, and I didn't know what to do. One thing was for sure. I wasn't letting her just waltz back in like nothing happened, but I was torn about whether Jason should meet her. I didn't want to take away his chance to know his biological mother, but I also didn't want her to hurt him like she hurt me. After sitting with it for a while, I decided to reach out to a friend of mine who's a lawyer. I wanted to know what I was dealing with legally. Could Sarah come back and demand visitation? Does she have any parental rights left after abandoning Jason for 10 years? My friend told me something that made me feel a lot better. He said that if a parent has been absent and failed to contact their child for over a year, they can have their parental rights terminated. In Sarah's case, it had been a decade. He reassured me that it would be next to impossible for her to get custody or even regular visitation, especially since she left without a trace and never bothered to reach out until now. I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders hearing that. With that relief, I decided it was time to tell Jason the full truth about his biological mother. Maggie and I had already been going to therapy with him to deal with some of the questions he had after seeing Sarah's photo. I wanted to make sure we did this the right way, so I brought it up in one of our sessions. Meanwhile, I was still trying to figure out what the hell Sarah wanted after all these years. So I reached out to her father. We hadn't talked in a long time, but we were still on good terms. He had been just as shocked and disgusted by Sarah's behavior as I was when she left. I asked him if he knew why Sarah was suddenly trying to come back into our lives. Turns out, Sarah had been in contact with her sister off and on over the years. Not about Jason, though. She was only reaching out for money whenever she needed help. According to her dad, Sarah had hit a rough patch. She was working a minimum wage job and living in a cramped apartment with 3 roommates. She'd been scraping by for years, but now even her sister had stopped helping her out. She was asking for more money than ever, and her sister just couldn't do it anymore. I felt bad for a second hearing about her situation, but then I remembered what she had done. She left me and her own child, She made her choices. Her dad even said that reintroducing her to Jason was probably not a good idea. She hasn't changed, he said. She's in no position to be a positive influence in his life. After talking to him, I reached out to Sarah's sister to get more details. Her sister was honest with me. She told me Sarah never asked about Jason, not once in the last 10 years. All she cared about was getting money to pay rent or cover groceries. And to top it off, Sarah's affair partner, the neighbor she left me for, was in prison for sexual assault. Apparently, he'd been locked up since 2015. Hearing that news, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I guess it was karma catching up to him, but it didn't make anything better for Jason or me. I asked her sister if Sarah knew about the divorce, and she told me Sarah still thought we were married. She didn't have a clue that I had filed for divorce years ago and moved on with my life. I told her to go ahead and fill Sarah in on the reality of the situation, how I had full custody of Jason, how Maggie and I had built a family together, and that Sarah had no claim over our son anymore. It was time for her to realize she couldn't just come back and pick up where she left off. When I told Maggie all of this, she was floored by Sarah's behavior. She couldn't believe how careless Sarah had been, not just in leaving, but in completely ignoring her own son for a decade. She was shocked about the affair partner too, though honestly it didn't surprise me. They were both a mess. It's been about a month since Sarah sent that email and she hasn't reached out again. I think once her sister explained everything to her, she realized there wasn't much she could do. Maggie and I have decided to move forward with legally adopting each other's kids. It's something we've talked about for a while, and this whole situation just pushed us to make it official. I doubt Sarah will contact us again. I think she knows she doesn't have any rights here, and hiring a lawyer would just waste her time and money. But if anything changes, I'll let you guys know. For now, we're focusing on our family and keeping our lives as peaceful as possible.